But my favorite prop from that show has to be her.
Well, if you got a dollar on just a lousy down, know that I got rhythm that could suit your budget fine.
Hi, this is Patrick with TrustyHucksterMercantile. If you've joined me before, welcome back. If this is your first time, then welcome to my channel. Again, TrustyHucksterMercantile. I have a presence on Etsy as a vintage reseller. Also have a presence on Instagram and Facebook and obviously YouTube. I have done a series of videos primarily showcasing what I've been purchasing to resell in my vintage shop, sometimes showing a little bit of what I've sold. Lately I've been doing some videos promoting a sale for clearance. All of those you'll find here on my channel. But if you hadn't noticed it, you can see a playlist there, and if you haven't heard of this, there is a challenge that was issued a few weeks ago by George, the Antique Nomad. You can find him at the Antique Nomad. He issued a challenge a few weeks ago called hashtag Show Off Your Bunker. And at last count, I think it ended up being 13 of us did videos which showcased where we lived while we were under the quarantine and highlighting some of the collections that we've built up from some of our thrifting and some of our reselling, and talking a little bit about maybe how some of those collections influence what we do in our online sales. So if you haven't checked that video out, please do so. But it got me thinking a little bit as I tried to come up with a new video. Can't do any new hauls because I'm under quarantine like everyone else, so I can't really go out shopping. What I started thinking about was when I showcased the Show Off Your Bunker video, I was talking a little bit about how some of these collections developed, and there was a common thread, and that was community theater. If you've watched that video, you watched any others, you know that that does actually come up quite a bit, because although I do have a full-time job, doing reselling is a side hustle for me. I also have a side hustle doing community theater. Typically, I like to act, but sometimes I will do props and I will do set dressing for productions either that I am in or that people have asked me to assist. So a lot of the things that I showcased in my home have actually graced the walls of a production or was originally purchased for a production, then I decided to keep it and build up that collection. But there were a lot of collections that I did not show, things that had been in storage, things that were in my bedroom that I just didn't do as part of the tour. So I decided to pull some of those things out and kind of carry a little bit of a story. And it's going to be a little bit of a mix. A lot of props, mostly vintage. If they're not vintage, they're vintage inspired. And this can cover any range because, as you would think with community theater, shows cover all different eras. And depending on the size of community theater, sometimes they have a lovely storage area. A lot of times they don't. One of my favorite theaters is in an old one-room schoolhouse. So they do not have the luxury of adding to their collection. Even if they do a period piece one year, they're doing the same period the next year. They may not have had the space to retain it. In many cases, I will keep it, and that is how Trusty Huckster Mercantile was formed. I started selling some of the items I originally purchased for resale. So a lot of what's I'm going to be going through starts off with my very first show. Okay. So as I go through some of these items, there's a little bit of a story that relates to me, along with everything else. We're going to cover some props, we're going to cover some set dressing, we're going to cover some costumes. One of the first is what I'm wearing right now. This is a Hawaiian styled shirt, blue with a blue and white dragon, big dragon on the back. This has actually popped up in a couple of productions. Anyone who knew me in high school wouldn't be surprised that I have an affinity for these types of shirts because I used to wear them all the time. I haven't typically worn them in my adulthood, but once I started doing some theater productions, this one became, I won't say a regular part of my wardrobe, but I did bring it into my wardrobe. There's another one that has a tiger on it that happens to be my personal favorite, but I decided to throw this one on today. This was in multiple productions, most notably and probably most recently was in a production of Mamma Mia, where I played Bill, one of the dads. So that is where we're going to start. But I'm going to start with the actual props with the very first show I ever did. About 4 years ago was my first show in a local theater called Albright Community Theater, located in Batavia, Illinois. And I lived in Batavia at the time, so it made sense for me to start there. And I auditioned for a very small role in The Miracle Worker. And if you know The Miracle Worker, all of the male roles are small roles, but I was traveling for my job. I really didn't know how community theater productions would work. I knew I might have to miss some rehearsals, so I asked for a small role, and I got it. I got the role of Mr. Anagnos, who is Annie Sullivan's teacher at her school where she learned sign language. Only in a couple of scenes, and in one of the scenes, I had to gift Annie Sullivan a ring. And the box that they had provided to me came out of the storage area from the theater. Albright is one that actually does have a storage area. And it was a relatively modern box. It was one of those velveteen, hinged boxes that you would see probably anywhere from the 60s on. But we were in the 1860s, I think maybe 1880s. So I didn't feel that was appropriate. So I found this. I honestly don't remember where I found it. I do believe I went to an antique shop, but I do not believe this is antique. But it is a rosewood hinged jewelry box that had the ring in it that I provided to her. It was a little bulky in my pocket, but it looked great on stage because your closest audience member is 20, 30 feet away. So you've got something that adds a little bit of presence, and it added a little bit of period presence, and it was a great addition, and I was really happy to have it. Because I purchased it, I then kept it. So this was the very first prop I ever purchased for any show, and that's how I kind of got my start in the behind-the-scenes aspect of theater. Once I was involved with that show at the Albright, I discovered that community theater, because we are not paid for our time, is very flexible. Working around people's schedule, including traveling salesmen such as myself. So the next show I auditioned for was also at the Albright, and I said, I don't want a small role, I want a big role. And I got it. The second show I did was a lead in a show called The Butler Did It. It was by Peter and Walter Marks. There's two versions of it, so it's the one done by the Marks. The show is somewhat of a farce, very silly. It was also a period piece. That one where Miracle Worker was, the 1880s, The Butler Did It is smack in the middle of the 1980s. So a lot of what I did was, polos with popped collars, some things like that. We were it's kind of a play within a play, and the play that takes place during that play, it takes place in a very high-end, wealthy family's New York apartment. And so we were trying to figure out different things we could put into that, onto the stage. If you've ever done community theater, it's very difficult to pull off an expensive apartment because most of the sofas they get are from Goodwill or found on the side of the road. So there had to be some little touches that we added. And one of the plot points from within the show talked about a silent butler. The butler did it. The word butler takes on many forms throughout the show. And several people actually didn't even know what a silent butler was. They thought it was a human butler that came in and just didn't say anything. So that was something I was actually aware of. So I kind of went forth again. This was a show. Now I was suddenly the lead. I wanted to make sure this was a good show. And I purchased this two-piece silent butler. They are designed to go together. I admittedly, when I purchased it, because they do kind of nestle together and they have the same design. Admittedly, when I picked it up, I didn't think they would go together because, to my knowledge, the other half of the silent butler is a brush. So there could just been this is in two sizes. We improvised. We made this the brush. This was the receptacle. So I had a silent butler. A very odd piece, something that even if I wanted to donate it to the theater, they probably wouldn't have wanted it because, what do you do with the silent butler? And so I ended up keeping it. And for a while, when I was actually prepping to do this video, I was thinking this was actually the first prop that I had ever purchased, forgetting about the ring box. But it's because the ring box has actually been used in multiple productions since. So I was forgetting that it was actually the very first show I was in was where the ring box came from. So this is a brass, unmarked. There are no maker's marks, no hallmarks, nothing on here. Brass. They were inexpensive when I purchased them, probably inexpensive when they were made. Very thin, but again, with the cut work it's something that you could see from the audience. So it looked fancy, even though I probably paid a couple bucks for them at most likely a Goodwill. Also in that production, there was a running gag that all of the alcohol on stage is fake alcohol because the stage was the stage for the play within a play. It was a weird show. It wasn't very good, but regardless, I had to have my own personal bar. So I found this vintage bar set with a little traveling case that we were able to store on stage. When I purchased it, the little shot glasses were not in there, and the Drambuie glass in the middle was not there. But, oh look, there's still liquids. Can guarantee you that's probably tea and this is water because it was community theater. You could, and the community theater in this particular case was on the top floor of the police department building. So there was no drinking taking place on stage, but we had to make it look like it. So this was something that was part of the show, tucked behind a sofa. We pulled it out. We had real drinks, even though they weren't real. So this was just one of those goofy little things that once I picked it up, I wanted to keep it. It did actually make an appearance in another show later as well, because it's just a vague, 70s, 80s, could be 60s, could be a little bit later, pleather. There's no tag, there's no maker's mark or anything on this piece. All the individual pieces are probably replacement pieces. Doesn't really matter. It was kind of a cool piece, and so that was another prop that I had for the Butler Did It at the Albright Company. This ended up being one of my favorite purchases of almost any show that I've done. This is a replica of the original Princess Mary tin that was sent from the royal family to all of the soldiers who served under British rule during World War I. Has the profile of Mary, her initial M. It says right at the bottom, Christmas 1914, which is the era when that show was actually taking place. At the top, it lists the countries who were involved: Belgium, Japan, Russia, France, Serbia, and Montenegro. Inside the real tin would have been either a small pack of cigarettes, maybe a small deck of playing cards, note paper, and a pencil. So there were a couple different versions of what was supplied. And so these went to every soldier who served. So these are not particularly rare, and they don't end up being particularly expensive, but they're more expensive than what I was looking to spend for something that was going to go on stage. So this was a replica picked up very inexpensively, and used this on stage. Probably no one in the audience had any idea what it represented, but it added that point of authenticity that I really like, and the actors all knew. And I actually got a couple of these so that the soldiers would all have them so we could open them up. Because I played a Scot, I got to wear a sporran. I did not get a vintage sporran. I got a very vinyl, simple one that, very cheap. But I got to put little things in it, and all things that were props for the show. One of them is I was supposed to pull out pictures and share with the soldiers. I didn't want the pictures to just be simple pieces of paper, so I actually got these little cardstock cutouts, I think probably from Michael's, and the little photo corners. Figured, I'm a Scotsman, so I put some terriers in there, and just grabbed some individual shots, printed them out sepia tone. I think that's Andrew Carnegie. Try to do some things that were relevant. Again, nobody from the audience would have seen these, but they might have seen it being tipped over and they're like, oh, that kind of looks like a picture. I tend to get a little, I tend to be a little over aware when I see a show, because if you don't put the effort into it thinking, the audience will never notice or the audience won't care, that's not true. I will often care. So I like those little touches, so I did them for myself. So those were two of the pieces. My character, it was a local author who'd written the show. It was an interesting concept. It was very difficult to actually perform in a theater space. We were supposed to be in a trench. We were supposed to climb out of that trench. That's difficult in a theater space. But my character, not only being a Scotsman, I was an eccentric Scotsman, and I actually had a flea circus. So I got this little tin at a surplus store. It's an Altoids tin, but it's never been printed on or anything. And I just had my first experience in doctoring something up to make it look old. So I hammered it, scratched it up, rubbed things on it, just tried to see what I could do. And then this is what I would pull out of my sporran to have my flea circus. So an odd little addition, but it's technically not vintage, but it added the aesthetic, had something that I could pull out, and it made conceptual sense that there could be fleas in this. The following year, I did a musical, and that was Little Women, and I played Professor Bear. And during the show, I got to use the ring box again. And then I also had another piece. This happened to be made by a friend of mine that he gifted this. He was actually in the show, The Butler did it. He gifted me this, and I thought it looked so great. It had the rope binding on it. His name's Galen Malik. He doesn't typically make them for resale. He just makes them as a hobby and gave them as gifts. I used this on stage when I was writing my letters to Joe March. So this, again, not vintage, had that vintage look, and it was kind of a nice addition for my first real musical. Later in that year, did a show that it was, again, a period piece. We went back to the 80s. 80s was a big era for theater. Even if the shows were not written in the 80s, it's a period piece that community theaters can do, because go to any Goodwill, you're going to find plenty of polos and bright colors, and you're going to be able to make it work. So in that one, I was in the 80s again, so I got to wear my bright blue suspenders. That one actually was an interesting show because it took place over 17 years. So it was the first show that I ever dyed my beard. So I dyed my very gray beard with mascara, and then the show took place over 17 years. So every time I ran off stage, and I had 11 costume changes, every time I ran off stage for a costume change, I would wipe off some of the mascara. So then by the time I got to the end of the show, I was back to my normal self, and I had aged 17 years. Now, my personal favorite comment was in the lobby afterwards, meeting a gentleman I did not know. He said, "Oh my God, your makeup was so great. How did you go from looking so good to looking like such crap?" I'm like, well, actually, this is what I normally look like. Thank you very much. So, it happens. But I've since dyed my beard. And actually, if you go back and look at some of my earlier videos, I look significantly younger than I do right now because I had dyed my beard for a show. And so when I did my first videos, I had very dark beard. That was actually dyed. So it eventually grew out. So suddenly I aged right before your eyes in a very quick succession. Because it was the 80s, I lived through the 80s. I had these little Soviet era pins. I do believe they are legitimate. I do not believe they are reproduction. These were identical to ones that I actually owned in the 80s. I actually traveled to the Soviet Union in 1989, and these are the types of pins that I had, like all the way down to the pin back. I couldn't find mine, so it was kind of fun to recreate these. Again, from the audience's standpoint, they were probably far more interested in the fact I was standing on stage naked, being hidden by a plant. That they could care less when I later put on little Soviet pins. Another show that I did was another period. Again, a lot of these, because I found it fun doing them. I don't actively search for period pieces, but I do enjoy them. And then when I'm involved with a period piece, that tends to be what I need to help them find props for. So this was a show that I did. It was based in the 1930s called She Loves Me. If you know the show, I played Kodai. It was probably one of my favorite characters, definitely my favorite singing role, because I got to play an absolute jerk, and I loved it. But because they placed in the 30s, had some touches of authenticity. I was supposed to basically have my little address book for all the women that I was sleeping with. And so this is technically an address book, but it is the size of, what would be a little black book. And it actually shows the year of the calendar that this is based on is 1935. So it is of the era. It was very small, so it fit into my suit pocket. I was wearing double-breasted suit because it was the 30s. It also took place in Hungary. And so the fact that it was in Hungary, this is something that also pops up in a lot of shows that I do. A lot of times you need money. And particularly when you're doing a period piece, you really shouldn't have... It's bad luck to actually use real money on stage anyway, just as a kind of a side thing. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but that's one of those odd superstitions. So what I tended to have available was foreign money. And so technically it's still real money, but no one in the show could spend it, so there wasn't a huge risk of it getting lost. And so this was the Xerox copy of the original Hungarian 100 pengo, Saz pengo. I think pengo is their currency. I wouldn't 100% know. But we needed a lot of this because it takes place in a perfume shop, so people are spending money. So we took the real money and turned it into Xeroxed money, so it's got a different sheen. But I used to travel internationally, and so I have just old currencies, in some cases currencies that don't exist anymore because they've been replaced by the euro. So this was Turkish. This one is, I believe, Chinese. I've traveled in Asia a lot. This one, I think, is Thailand, Mexico. So I just had a wide variety, and these are probably all worth like 5 cents. Little ones. This is actually a ruble. This is a Russian ruble. So it's just an odd little collection that I had built up. At once upon a time, this was all currency that I used. I might have purchased some of these. The Hungarian one was purchased. I may have purchased some of these, just because of the way they looked. In my bedroom, I actually have a wall of these framed. The original of this is actually on my wall, so I didn't take it down. So just one of those oddball things that it turned into a collection, but I don't necessarily actively collect it. But it is kind of fun. So when I pull it out to go into a show, particularly if I use it more in a show where I'm the one using the money, because I don't want it to walk off, because some people just think it's cool. But I have this large collection of a variety of currencies, and even if the money is different, this is an Italian lira, even if the money is in the wrong country, we're actually supposed to be in Hungary, and I was, showing lira. No one from the audience would know, but it was always fun to try and, do those details and have currency that could match, right, if I could. Another piece I did was a show called The Man with the Plastic Sandwich. No one's heard of it. I couldn't even tell you who wrote it. I was the man with the plastic sandwich. And this was one of a handful of purchases, but this I think was the only one that I actually retained following the show. It took place at a theater called Riverfront Playhouse in downtown Aurora, Illinois. And they luckily do have a nice storage facility and had a lot of props that were available. The show took place in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And this is actually a reproduction. It's got Aladdin's website on the back, so they must have reproduced this at some point. But it had the perfect look for being on stage, the plaid thermos. So this was just one of those cool things. I don't think it's actually been used in any production since, but those are the things that I tended to keep, were items that either I had a personal affinity for just because I really thought they were cool, or because I anticipated they'd be able to be used in another production and I wouldn't have to go out and buy them again. I tended to think a lot of things needed to be kept, and again, that is why Trusty Huckster Mercantile exists. I'm selling off a lot of the items that I retained that I discovered are relatively easy to source. So instead of going through the hassle of storing it and having something possibly get damaged, whatever, get rid of it, and then the next time I might need one, I can probably go to Goodwill and find one. One of the favorite roles that I've ever had doing community theater is a show called Death Trap. If you're familiar with the show, a lot of people know the movie from the early 80s, starred Michael Caine and Christopher Reeve. There's quite a bit of an age difference between Christopher Reeve and Michael Caine, and Christopher Reeve being the younger of the two. When I auditioned for the role, the person that I was most age appropriate for was Sydney. However, the two people that the director chose to be in those two roles were myself and another actor who was actually only 1 month younger than me. So for all points and purposes, we were the same age. As she played it out, she had seen that I had been able to dye my beard to be younger in other shows. This was the same theater that I did Professor Bear. That was another one where I dyed my beard. So she made the decision to make me the Christopher Reeve role. And as such, I was supposed to play someone in my 20s. So I was a 47, 48-year-old person trying to play significantly younger. The beard helped, but it ended up being a perfect role for me, probably a far better role for me than even the one that was more age appropriate. And I had a blast. I got to be shot by an arrow. You know, spoiler alert, I get killed. I get shot by an arrow and fall down the stairs. My shoulder still has not quite recovered. I have problems with every once in a while, so keep that in mind if you ever want to do community theater. But it was a period piece that now again took place in the 70s, and the director had designed the set. And maybe a little side note, set design is the details of where all of the major components are going to be. So that's saying, okay, the sofa is going to be here, the door is going to be there, the bar is going to be over here, the fireplace is over here. The director then, based on how that design is set, or how the set is designed, will then be able to say, okay, you're going to stand up from the sofa and walk over to the bar, and then you're going to leave the bar and you're going to go out the door, and they'll know where all of those are. When you get into set dressing is where you start making a decision, okay, well, you need a sofa. What kind of sofa? So one of my best friends ended up being in the production with me. Sherry and I did a lot of the set dressing for the show. The director did a lot of that as well, but where we started was filling in some of the gaps, and a lot of pieces were borrowed. A lot of things were pulled from that theater's storage area. Stagecoach Players has a massive building with a massive storage area. But again, we were at a very specific era, and we wanted things to be as age correct as possible, particularly since I was not playing my age. But we wanted everything to look the late 70s. And so the show itself took place in 1978. So one of the things that I picked up were playbills for shows that opened in 1978. The main character is a playwright, so having playbills on the set actually made sense. No one would necessarily have known that these were period specific, and really, unless you got really close to the stage, you probably wouldn't have even seen them. But to me, that's a lot of what set dressing is. It adds those little details, it adds the little nuances for the era, gets everyone in the mood, and just has fun things like that. So I found these playbills were one addition, and then also the show itself took place in the fall of 1978. So I found the 1979 Ford Thunderbird sales catalog, because that's when the 79s would have been coming out. So this was sitting in a magazine rack, practically front and center, so that everyone that walked by the stage would have seen it. It was one of my proudest finds, and I probably paid $1 for it. I mean, this was not expensive. It was just super cool, and it was definitely something that I was not letting dissolve back into the vaults of that theater company. So this was a fun, actually, vintage edition. A non-vintage edition, but vintage in looks, is a set of trick handcuffs. The trick handcuffs are important. These technically are not trick handcuffs. They're actually quite convoluted to try and open. There's this massive key, and then you have to turn this key, and then that's what unlocks them, but then the key doesn't come back out until they're relocked. So I had to buy 2 of these because I had to, spoiler, I had to die behind the sofa, but not really die, while handcuffed, and then be able to get out of the handcuffs. And so I had to have a different pair. It was, you look really closely, it's probably some of my fake blood is still on this. These were just a fun find. These are an Amazon purchase, but they're supposed to be, according to this in the script, these are on display on the wall. These are Houdini's handcuffs. So from a distance, these look fantastic. Totally worked. They made some great sounds as we struggled, as he tried to kill me while I was handcuffed. This was fun, and I had to keep them. So we have that, and I've actually loaned these to another production of Death Trap because these are so iconic that this just gives a great look. So this is, again, even though they're not technically vintage, definitely gives the vintage look. I didn't want this video to be too long, so I literally have a steamer trunk that's filled with additional props, additional costumes. I really decided what I wanted to finish with was one more show that showcase, I wanted to showcase it because it also contains one of my favorite props that I ever made for a production. And it was a production of Jekyll and Hyde the musical. It also happened to take place at Stagecoach Players in DeKalb, Illinois. And this was a show that I did have a small part in, but I was primarily there to be the props master. And I designed all of the props, all of the set dressing. Again, the set design was done by another individual named Wendy. And she had planned on doing the entire thing, but she knew that I had an affinity for it, asked if I wanted to help, and we ended up having a blast creating Dr. Jekyll's laboratory, his sitting room, and one of the pieces that I had in there was this vintage silver plate or chrome. I believe it's a mustard dish or some sort of a sauce dish. There's a place for this spoon. Again, picture this where the audience is 20 to 30 feet away. This is a case where he was able to pop this open. I can't remember what he actually had in here. I think we put maybe cotton swabs or something. I can't remember what we did. But he just had an entire little bench with pieces like this. There's a non-base silver bowl that he used as a wash basin. There was a pewter jug that he used to rinse water. All kinds of great pieces, some of which I still have, some of which I've already sold, because again, this one took place in 19th century Victorian London. There was just a great opportunity for some beautiful set dressing, and this was one of the individual pieces that I happen to still have. But my favorite prop from that show has to be her. If I can find it, I will do a before and after picture, because the show took place in October. I started looking for these for a creepy doll basically during the summer, but during the summer people were already prepping for Halloween, so anything that already looked like this was either unavailable or was ridiculously expensive for what I wanted to spend. So what this started as was one of those absolutely adorable little porcelain dolls with curled hair, and she had a little gingham dress with a little white apron and white stockings and little black Mary Jane shoes. And then I turned her into this. And I will admit, I had far too much joy doing this. I cut her hair, I put oil in it, I did all kinds of stuff. I tea stained her body, I took magic markers, I ripped her arm off, I ripped her leg off, I broke off her foot, I broke off her fingers, I poked out her eyeballs, one of which is still inside. This was on stage for no more than probably 3 minutes. It was at the top of the show. The show opens in an insane asylum, and there's a woman sitting downstage rocking this baby in her arms. This is what she rocked. And I will say, the person who did this, she loved it more than I did. I had to make sure she didn't steal it when the show was over, because this thing was coming home. I believe she named her Hannah. So this is Hannah. Again, this was just one of my favorite props to have to make, because I tend to source props and source set dressing, and really of all the things I've shown, these are the only two pieces that I've ever actually tried to age in a way to make them look something other than what they are. That is not a skill set I have. We had to make a breakaway cane, we had to make a sword within a cane. Some other people who are far more superior to that kind of thing than I am came to my aid and was able to do those. So I was very proud of myself that I was able to come up with a very creepy doll that, again, was barely on stage for hardly any time at all, but was a fun addition. And I'm sure she was new at the time, but she's looking mighty vintage now. So that's kind of a little show and tell. You may not have cared, you may not even be still watching it right now, and I apologize that not everything is perfectly vintage, but it's one of those cases that we all have a story. We all have a way that we got to where we are, and several of the pieces that I've done through the community theater, which is very important to me, is helped me launch Trusty Huckster Mercantile. It's given me some extra income, which can help me buy additional props and costumes for myself and for others doing additional theater productions. I've started directing shows, and so I use some of this extra money that can go to support community theater. But for now, this was my show and tell for my theater prop and set dressing collection, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you've gotten this far and you haven't already done so, I really would appreciate a thumbs up on the video. If you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe. Who knows what I'll be doing next. But again, thank you for joining me. This is Patrick with TrustyHucksterMercantile. Have a good day. Goodbye.
Give me a good deal on something I can use. Make me an offer that I just can't refuse. When that sunrise in the morning and there's nothing there to do, will probably be the last time I see you.